Good afternoon and welcome everybody. We are delighted to have you here for this program today with Seba on Ethel Rosenberg, on her wonderful book about Ethel Rosenberg. So we're looking forward to getting started. I just have to make a few comments and thank yous, and then we will jump right into the program. If you are, please everybody remain muted. While the program is happening, we will unmute you for questions and answers, but I would like everybody to please remain muted for now. Okay, first I need to thank my partners at the other South Florida JCCs, who are just wonderful to work with, and we are bringing you programs throughout the season, sometimes twice a month. And I'd like to thank David Surowitz from the Michael Ann Russell JCC, Debbie Hockman from Posnack JCC, Danny Reed from the Galbert Family JCC, and Marcy Levitt from the Alper JCC. Of course, I want to thank the Jewish Book Council, who makes these programs possible, who allows us to bring these wonderful authors to you virtually and in person, year after year after year, and it's a wonderful opportunity for us. And the way we thank our authors is to read their books and buy their books. So book buying information will be posted in the chat, and I encourage you to do so. This book is a wonderful, wonderful read. Let me just introduce our author and our guest moderator. Seba is a prize-winning biographer, lecturer, and former Reuters foreign correspondent who has written several books, including That Woman and Les Parisiens, a former chair of Britain's Society of Authors and now on the council, and is also a senior research fellow at the Institute of Historical Research. She lives in London. And Eric Nemiroff, thank you for agreeing to participate in our program today. I invited Eric because of his astute observations on anything that we have ever discussed. I love to talk to Eric about everything. He has a strong background in legal issues, political science, history, and more. And he is a careful reader and will have some interesting questions for Anne as well. So without further ado, let's get started, and we will have more comments at the end. Anne, I'm going to spotlight you, and you can begin your presentation whenever you're ready. Welcome, thank you.
Well, thank you. And
wow.
Thank you.
My apologies, I'm going to mute everybody. Go on.
Thank you for inviting me, and I apologize for the slight delay. One should really be thrilled that the technology works at all and not surprised when it doesn't, but fingers crossed. Anyway, you've had a good long time to look at my opening picture, which is not just a plug for the book, but I think it really encapsulates the story. Here was an ordinary woman. It could have been me or you perhaps, and it's a woman in the toils of men. I really thought when I started researching this book that 70 years was a good time to take a fresh look at it, not just because 70 years is a useful publisher's peg, but because 70 years really seemed to me a time when the dust would have settled and one might have some perspective on the issues being discussed. How wrong I was. It was completely raw still for many people, but other people in England were unaware of the story. So the other reason for 70 years is that if you're going to catch people who are alive, now is the time to do it or not at all. And I was fortunate to meet Ethel's psychotherapist who helped her son when she was first sent to prison, who I rushed to meet aged 96 in California, but I didn't need to rush because she's still alive and thriving at 100, and she's a wonderful person. I met a woman who was in prison with Ethel, who has since died, but I've also had the pleasure to meet Ethel's two sons, who are now in their late 70s. This was not an authorized book. I absolutely did not want to do that. So I interviewed Michael and Robbie a few times, and then I went off and wrote the book myself. So as I say, in England, if you mention Ethel Rosenberg, people will say to you, oh, the Rosenbergs, those spies, as if they're one indissoluble unit. So that was one of the first things I wanted to do, really to extrapolate Ethel. At some level, the story isn't complex at all. It's very simple. Julius was a spy and aspiring recruiter. Ethel was his wife who knew and who approved, but that is not a crime. In fact, in American law, it's not even expected of a spouse to report her other half for wrongdoing. It's only taking overt action. So that's where this dramatic miscarriage of justice comes in, because the authorities somehow had to try and prove an overt action. But people seem to know about the death more than the life. And that was the other thing I was trying to do, to recreate a life brutally cut short. Ethel was 37 when she was killed, the only American killed for a crime other than murder. And many people know, for example, the last line of the bell jar. It was a queer, sultry summer, the summer they electrocuted the Rosenbergs. So the death was announced on the television by Bob Considine, who you're going to see shortly. But here are her two sons, Michael and Robbie, who had to learn about the fact that they were now orphans from reading the papers and from watching television and listening to the radio. I don't know if you can hear. Can you give me a nod? Can you hear Bob Considine and what he's saying? Okay. Then I'll pick up at the end of this.
The doctors went over and pulled down the cheap prison dress, a little dark green printed job, and placed the I can't say it. Placed the stethoscopes to her, and then looked around and looked at each other rather dumbfounded and seemed surprised that she was not dead. Believing she was dead, the attendants had taken off the ghastly strappings and electrodes and the black belts and so forth. And these had to be readjusted again, and she was given more electricity, which started again that kind of a ghastly plume of smoke that rose from her head and went up against the skylight overhead. After two more of those jolts, Ethel Rosenberg had met a maker. She'll have a lot of explaining to do too.
So the point about Bob Considine is that you will have heard him say the misogyny lay through it, and he was a good guy who subsequently campaigned against the death sentence, but he uttered the words that had she been given 3 jolts, it would have been enough to kill an ordinary person. The tragedy of the fact that the straps didn't fit, and so they had to take her off the chair when her heart was still beating. It's the most gruesome depiction of a death. It would be hard to find a more barbaric description of the death. So, and also he talks about her cheap green and white prison job, but there's no discussion, of course, of what Julius was wearing. So that's the sort of casual misogyny of the era. Now, I do want to go back to the life, as I said, because that's the task I set myself. So here is the tenement where Ethel was born in 1915, 64 Sheriff Street, and both her parents were immigrant Jews who remained illiterate in English. They only spoke Yiddish. So Ethel acted as their interpreter. Her father, Barney, by all accounts, was a good, sweet, gentle man, not aspirational at all. The problem for Ethel was her mother, who you see here, Tessie. Tessie really did not cherish Ethel. Ethel was her first child, but there were 3 other boys, and all the love went into the boys, but especially the youngest boy, David, who was 7 years younger. As far as Tessie was concerned, education didn't matter for a girl at all, and Ethel was a clever girl. So Ethel's life really changed when she went here to Seward Park High School. And here is the theatre and assembly hall. And although Ethel was a shy child, she was clever, as I say, but somehow acting and singing transformed her. So Ethel really imbibed the American dream. And you can say that she was quite right too, because other people who went to the school were Walter Matthau, Tony Curtis, Zero Mostel. And when I went, and you walk through the door and you see what I could imagine, this new world opening up for Ethel. It had an Olympic-sized swimming pool, and every student had to be able to swim before they could graduate, an Olympic-sized library. And although Ethel could have gone to college, because college for women was just opening up, aged 15 in 1931, in fact, she had to leave, and her mother insisted that she got a job as a stenographer, so she did a secretarial training. However, in between the years of her leaving school and becoming an adult, I learnt an awful lot about what made Ethel tick. Now, I just want to digress for a moment and say a word about the photographs. When Ethel and Julius were arrested, the FBI took all their photographs and all their letters. And I often ponder what that must have done to kids to grow up without any images of them with their parents as kids or babies. So many of the photographs I'm showing you, in fact, almost all of them, are pictures that have come back to the 2 boys, Robbie and Michael, sent to them by kind friends. So, for example, this yearbook that I'm showing you, the Seward Park High School has a complete set of yearbooks, but not 1931 when Ethel graduated. Why? Because at the time, anyone who knew Ethel and Julius, or who was at school with them, as you see, she's Ethel Greenglass here, was so terrified that they too would be picked up that any connection with the Rosenbergs was often destroyed. But as you see here, when Ethel graduated, she was known as the class actress. I happened to find this book in California because I just went through all the pupils who'd been with Ethel and eventually found the daughter of somebody who had kept one, so we've digitized it, and the end of the story is that Seward Park now does have a complete set of yearbooks. After school, Ethel continued her acting. She joined a settlement house and did amateur dramatics. So here's Ethel in Amdram. This is one of the pictures that came back to the boys quite recently. Ethel also wanted to sing, and this gave me an indication of her single-mindedness. She applied to not just any old choir, but the very best, Schola Cantorum, the choir that sang at Carnegie Hall with conductors like Otto Klemperer and Toscanini. So this too was really opening up Ethel's eyes to the world outside. But the interesting thing is that when she went to audition the first time, they turned her down, and instead of just walking away and thinking, well, of course, I couldn't expect to sing there, she went home and found a piano that was thrown away on the sidewalk, because this was the depth of the Depression. People would prefer to have an empty room that they could rent than a piano. And Ethel took the piano back and taught herself sight singing. She was accepted the second time round, and she was the youngest chorister to sing with Schola Cantorum. But she only stayed for a year, probably because they went on tour and her mother needed the money. So Ethel got a job working for a packing company, and the packing company had a strike for better wages and conditions. And Ethel became a ringleader, really, of the strike. She lay down on the road, preventing lorries from entering. And one of the interesting things I learned about her is that she had her pay docked during that time, and the newly formed National Labour Relations Board, when they pronounced on her case, said that she was quite justified in striking and she should be given her back pay. And I think that's where you see the beginning of Ethel's social activism. And the woman I met who knew her in prison, Miriam Moskowitz, told me that Ethel always said this was the beginning of her social activism. So she became a communist in 1936. 1936 was such a key year in Europe when Hitler marched into the Rhineland. In France, there was a Popular Front government with a communist. In Spain, there was a dictator, Franco, who was trying to overturn the legitimate Republican government. So if ever there was a time to try and fight the dictators, Hitler, Mussolini and Franco, 1936 was the moment. And it was also in 1936 that she met Julius. Ethel was doing a lot of singing for galas and welfare benefits. And at one of these, she met Julius because apparently he calmed her nerves. She was nervous that night. Julius was, and this became important, 2.5 years younger than Ethel, and that was the only evidence against her when the judge and prosecution claimed that she was the ringleader, that she was somehow the master, and Julius her servant. This too, I love this picture. Anyone with any familiarity with the case will realize that once Ethel was charged, there were no pictures of Ethel looking nice or sweet or remotely pretty. They all portrayed her as an unsmiling, sour, dumpy housewife. If I could have only one picture in my book, it would be this, which is Ethel as a new mother. So Michael was born in 1943, by which time America had joined in the war. Being a communist was very uncomfortable from 39 to 41 because of the Nazi-Soviet pact, the Ribbentrop-Molotov pact. And many people left the Communist Party then, but not Ethel and Julius. They remained. And then in 1941, when Hitler attacked the Soviet Union, and then later in 41, when America joined in after Pearl Harbor, suddenly the Russians were America's allies, our allies. And so the American government had to persuade ordinary people, suddenly, I know we said that the Russians are our enemies. Well, now they're our allies and they're bravely fighting our cause. So in order to win people over, there were a lot of rallies and films, you'd call them propaganda today, to explain to people why the Soviets were to be supported. And it was at one of these rallies that Julius made himself known to Russian diplomats and explained that he was an engineer and he had many friends who were engineers. He worked in a restricted occupation. He wasn't called up because he had asthma and bad eyesight, and he offered information to Russia. I'm not remotely suggesting that it's within the gift of an individual citizen to make information known, however sympathetic you may be to that country's cause. I'm simply explaining how it happened. So Michael was born in 1943, and from then on, Ethel really put all her emphasis on being a good mother. What I've discovered about her is her extraordinary single-mindedness, and when she turned her mind to a project that became her full focus. So being a good mother, and particularly being a better mother than her own, Tessie Greenglass, became everything that Ethel wanted to do. Michael was a difficult and challenging child. He was very clever, but this was the beginning of a time when there were books being written about how to be a better mother. And Ethel believed in the power of books, in the discoverability of all things. But not only that, she had a subscription to Parents Magazine, and she went to mothering classes. And she didn't go to any old classes. She found a Viennese emigre called Edith Buxbaum. And these were sort of avant-garde methods of being a better mother that Ethel learnt. So during the war, her younger brother, David, who wasn't nearly as clever and who flunked many of his exams, and who was a much more avid communist than Ethel and Julius, was, by some extraordinary lapse of security, not sent overseas with his platoon, but to Los Alamos, which is where America was building its atomic weapons, nuclear weapons, the Manhattan Project. And probably, although it's contested, Julius was out of the loop at this time. He'd already introduced David and Ruth, his wife Ruth, to his circle, believing that they could offer interesting information. David was a lowly machinist, but this is how the whole thing unraveled, so that in 1950, this is the picture that everyone seems familiar with, Julius was arrested first. How did it happen? Well, the Americans were working hard on deciphering some secret cables sent by Russian agents to Moscow, to their handlers. And it's only in 1995 that this secret information was given a name. It was called Venona. And so the authorities wanted to keep this secret because they thought it would lead to the capture of many other people. But they knew from it that Julius Rosenberg had been involved in spying. But before that, they arrested in England a very clever, a brilliant physicist called Klaus Fuchs. And Klaus Fuchs was arrested in 1950 in Cambridge. He confessed immediately, but he did what many spies did. He named names, and he named his courier Harry Gold. But Klaus Fuchs was convicted after he confessed, and the British really did not want to make a big deal of this. They were rather embarrassed that they'd had this brilliant emigre scientist who they'd sent as part of their team to Los Alamos. So the trial was not given much publicity, and he was given the maximum sentence under British law for espionage, which is 14 years. He served 10, and then he left the country and went back to East Germany. Now, the American attitude to spying was completely different. They wanted to show the world that they were really dealing with these pesky communist spies, and they wouldn't put up with anything. So Klaus Fuchs names Harry Gold. Harry Gold names David Greenglass and Ruth. And David names, and this is important, only one person. He names Julius Rosenberg. And if you read his grand jury testimony, he says, leave my sister out of it, not just because she's my sister. Ethel had nothing to do with this. But by the time he came to trial, he changed his story. And because Julius refused to name names, this is when the authorities decided, well, we'd better arrest his wife too, because she'll act as a lever. And this is the lever strategy. They couldn't believe that a young wife in her early 30s with 2 children would not do anything to get free, and that she would name names. But they both remained silent throughout, to the point where, when they finally electrocuted Ethel, the Deputy Attorney General Brownell said, she called our bluff, didn't she? So They were both charged with conspiracy to commit espionage. Conspiracy is almost impossible to disprove. It's the espionage that I take issue with. It becomes quite clear in the Venona cables. There were thousands of them, and only 3,000 were decrypted. And Ethel is only named in one, not with a code name. The KGB did not think she was a spy. And in fact, they specify she does not work and explain that means she doesn't work for the KGB. After this photograph was taken, Ethel and Julius were never allowed to touch again, let alone embrace, when Julius was finally brought to Ethel's cell when she was in solitary at Sing Sing. He had to sit in a cage outside. The government really, and the media colluded in this, were now at pains to show the world that Ethel was such a wicked person, so transgressive, that she threatened the whole nature of what it meant to be an American wife and mother. There was an idea that the Allies, having won the war, were now in danger of losing the peace. And the reason that the Americans felt like this, and it does need explaining because it's important, there was a real existential fear that the communists, and of course this was whipped up by McCarthy, that the communists, now that they had access to a bomb, might drop it on New York or on America. This Collier's magazine is a dystopian version of what would happen if there was a third world war. And the reason that the Americans were so scared, you could take it back to Yalta, you could take it back to Fulton, Missouri, when Churchill makes his Iron Curtain speech. There are many steps, but mostly it was when Russia exploded an atomic bomb in Kazakhstan in 1949, and the Americans had not expected Russia to have access to nuclear weapons for at least another 10 years. And then China became communist, and then in 1950 there's the Korean War when communist North Korea invades the South, and there's a belief really that the whole communist world is somehow one terrifying mass, and everything has to be done to stop communists giving information and somehow to show the world that America is going to stand strong. I'm sure you've recognized a younger Mr. Trump, but Roy Cohn, who's the man with the scar on his nose, was only 23 at the time of the trial. He was very clever, young, brash, Jewish American deputy prosecutor who was absolutely determined to make this case something that he was responsible for winning in his zeal against the communists. So he came up with the story that David Greenglass told, that he had seen his sister typing. The reason I've got "Where is my Roy Cohn?" I'm sure you all know when Trump was about to leave the White House in frustration, he was heard to utter "Where is my Roy Cohn?" because Cohn went on to work for him at one point. This is not Ethel's typewriter, but it's exactly the same. And the reason that the typewriter conspiracy or typewriter perjury is so important is because it went to the heart of what it meant to be an American wife and mother in 1951 when the trial started. Because if you can't trust the woman who does the typing for you, and it might be your wife, your mother, your daughter, or whomever, who can you trust? So this is all part of the symbolism to show subliminally how Ethel was somehow undermining all that was good about American womanhood. And this is the young judge, Irving Kaufman, who, like Roy Cohn, was determined to prove that Jews were patriotic Jews and they wanted to distance themselves from the Lower East Side communist, Bolshevik, impoverished Jewish people whom Ethel and Julius represented. And Kaufman was the one who said in his summing up that Ethel was such a terrible mother, and she had put her children, she had put serving the interests of communism above the interests of her children. So the trial was really like a theatrical performance full of stage props. This jello box, and you can see the asymmetric cut on the bottom, was alleged to have been Julius's idea given to Ruth to use as a recognition symbol. Well, if it ever had existed, it's not clear that Julius was the inventor of the scheme, and anyway, the original would have gone to Russia. So this is a facsimile. But again, it was introduced in the trial, and Roy Cohn kept cutting it up a dozen times to convey every American housewife has a box of Jello in their store cupboard, you know, and here is Ethel, who is abusing one of the basic products in the kitchen of every American housewife. So this was made much of in a wonderful piece of artwork by Martha Rosler, a big collage, but part of the installation was this tea towel in which she embroidered the letter from President Eisenhower denying clemency. And he did so on the grounds unproven that Ethel was clearly the master in this conspiracy, and how dangerous it would be. He understood it was terrible to kill a woman and a mother, but it had to be done because think of all the spies that Russia would recruit from among women, as if there'd never been a female spy before in the world. This picture is Ethel leaving the Women's House of Detention after she'd had the death sentence, waving to her friends on her way to Sing Sing. And the reason I wanted to show it is because it's so rare to find a picture of Ethel smiling. She wasn't a fashion plate and she wasn't particularly beautiful, but it's just rare to see her smiling. And I probably should finish at this point, and then perhaps we can have questions. But the letters from Ethel while she's in prison, I think, are extraordinary, and I had access to them. I understand that some of the letters between Julius and Ethel were probably written for public consumption, but I think the letters to her children are unbelievably moving, and I think they also show that Ethel was a realist and she was aware that she'd probably be killed, and how on earth could she somehow provide for her sons? She realized she couldn't provide material goods, but she felt that the best she could offer them was a legacy of loyalty, as opposed to the green glass legacy of betrayal. So here's what she said. My dearest darlings, this is the process known as sweating it out, and it's tough, that's for sure. At the same time, we can't let a lot of chickens that go about their business without panic, even when something's frightening them. We can't let them put us to shame, can we? Maybe you thought that I didn't feel like crying too when we were hugging and kissing goodbye, huh? Even though I'm slightly older than 10. Darlings, that would have been so easy, far too easy on myself. And I had to resist a very real temptation to follow your lead and break down with you, because I love you more than I love myself, and because I knew you needed that love far more than I needed the relief of crying. So I guess if my book is about one thing, it's about the importance of the rule of law. I also think it's about families, and it starts off with this very dysfunctional family, the Greenglasses, and it ends with this extraordinarily redemptive family, the Mirapols. Here you see Anne Mirapol, who was a teacher and actress and musician, and they did not know Ethel and Julius, and they had to fight to look after these two boys, which indeed they did. Here's Abel Mirapol. He was a lyricist and he wrote the words to Strange Fruit. I think they were extraordinary in looking after Robbie and Michael, and in teaching them the basic Jewish or any moral respect for their parents without turning their parents into martyrs. So perhaps I'll hand over to Eric because I think my voice is going. I'm terribly sorry.
That's fine.
I hope I've given you the bare bones of a really shocking story. And I think the only other thing I'd say about the 70 years is the extraordinary amount of art and theatre and books that have appeared, focusing on Ethel, not Julius. I mean, Julius was a spy, but Ethel is much more conflicted and complex. So I'm sure there's lots we can discuss. Shall I hand over?
Yes,
Thank you.
please. You can turn off the stop sharing, and then we will have you on the full screen. Okay, perfect. And for everybody else, it's best to watch this in speaker view if you'd like. Then you will just see Eric and Anne on the screen. I'm going to add myself there. Okay, first, I want to thank you for that really fantastic slideshow that enhanced our knowledge and our understanding so much. So I really appreciate that. And I'm glad we ironed out the technology so that it could work. I'm going to turn it over to Eric and we will go from there. Eric, you can unmute.
Thank you, Stephanie. Wow, Anne, I really appreciated this. When you started to write this book, it seemed to me that you undertook an enormous challenge. And the challenge would be to get people under 80 to understand the sense of paranoia and panic which permeated the political bodies. And thinking about that, I was wondering, because of my last job teaching, were right-leaning politicians, do you think, catering to the public's fears in order to sully their left-leaning rivals and to gain a partisan advantage? I'm trying to help people to understand the whole psychic environment of America in a state of anxiety.
So I'm not sure what the question is, but you're right. It was a tough ask. I didn't grow up with American politics. I did live in America for a couple of years. And I came upon this story, like many people, when I was a young mother in Brooklyn with 2 kids, and I read the book of Daniel. And something about that story stayed with me. I find it amazing that Dr. O wrote that book before a lot of the evidence came out, but he somehow imagined the madness of America. And I actually think Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar really encapsulates it amazingly well, this precise moment. I mean, I do always feel a need to say, I love America. My daughter was born there. She's an American citizen. So, you know, I do think this is not to be seen as America gone crazy. I think it's a very precise moment. And as a historian, I always have real difficulty when people say to me, well, compare it with another moment, because the variables are too great. I mean, I think immediately after the war, there's so much one should say about 1950 and what that means when the war was so close and how it seemed to go wrong almost immediately in 46. When you look at the pictures of Yalta and those 3 elderly statesmen who were all ill in their various ways, you know, they simply did not have the strength. So Eisenhower felt, well, I'm the war leader. Maybe I wasn't strict enough, strong enough towards the communists. I'm not going to give in now. And I think, you know, one thing leads to another, and that close proximity to the end of the war and the fact that so many lives had been lost. And what was it all for? Surely it was fighting for the American way of life. So I sort of do understand this fear and paranoia, although of course it was whipped up by McCarthy. McCarthy, who in only another year, 54, had overreached himself with the army hearings. If they could have spun out their time in prison. And you know, the other thing to say is, Eisenhower could have been really strong by giving Ethel a custodial sentence, and then I wouldn't be talking about this book. There wouldn't be a story. It's the ridiculous necessity to kill that seems so excessive. And I've just got one more thing to say. If you're asking me about comparators or comparisons, I don't like making them because the variables are too great. But I have to say, when Lukashenko downed that plane in Belarus with Roman Protasevich and his girlfriend, completely against international law, just claiming there was a terrorist on board, it seemed to me that was a glimpse into what happens when there's such fear and when a government, willingly distorts law because it feels there's an interest at heart. And although the two cases are not remotely similar in many ways, it struck a chord for me because Ethel's family, the Green Glasses, came from Minsk, from Belarus, and I'd been to Minsk just a few months beforehand, and I just thought, what happens when you really can't do anything because the law is broken.
Well, it seemed to me at the time and shortly afterward that among American Jews, there was a desperate need to believe that the Rosenbergs were innocent. There was a feeling that there was too much of a Jewish patina covering this case. And there was a rallying of leftists around the world. You describe in the book the vast crowds that appeared in front of the White House and at other demonstrations and across Europe, starting before this Jewish audience. Do you think that the stench of anti-Semitism was involved in the harshness of handling of this case?
I find the anti-Semitism issue really tough to pin down. You're quite right. It has to be addressed. I'm sure anti-Semitism was part of the sort of toxic stew. You only have to look at the courtroom, which is full of a Jewish judge, a Jewish prosecutor, Jewish assistant prosecutor, Jewish defense lawyer, and Jewish defendant. So everybody's Jewish except the jury. So why is there not in a place like New York a Jewish jury? And other people have gone through all the jurors and the prospective jurors, and it seems that many Jewish prospective jurors excused themselves. They did not want to be responsible for sentencing a fellow Jew. On the other hand, Manny Block, who was given quite a lot of time to challenge the jurors, did not necessarily think that a Jewish juror would have done him any favors, just as they weren't certain that a female juror would do them any favors. People have a strange way of counterbalancing and how they want to be seen. And in fact, the one female juror that they did end up with was one of the most vocal in wanting to go through, find Ethel and Julius guilty. So where is the anti-Semitism if one tries to pin this issue down? Well, the anti-Semitism was not responsible for their arrest. There was a clear chain of events. Venona was deciphered. It led to Klaus Fuchs, as I said, and that's how they were arrested. It wasn't that they were going around looking for Jews. Julius was a spy, and he was named in the Venona documents. Equally, I don't think you can say that there was an increase of anti-Semitism as a result of their killing. The Jewish community was divided. I talk at length about this man, Morris Ernst, who was absolutely determined to find them guilty because he did not want the idea to take hold that Jews in America were not patriotic. I mean, Ethel and Julius would argue, of course, that they were patriotic. This was just a way of making America better. That they weren't somehow. It's a complicated idea, but so the Jewish community is divided on this, and where do you actually pin down the anti-Semitism? Because as you rightly say, it pervades the atmosphere, and once the clemency campaign got going, that was largely filled with Jews, but not entirely. And of course, in France, you have the Pope and Einstein and Jean-Paul Sartre all combining to fight for clemency, and Picasso. So in France, it was not a Jewish campaign. I think I'll give the last word to Arthur Miller, because when he was asked about the anti-Semitism, and don't forget the Crucible was on at the time, and he said the Crucible is not specifically about the Rosenbergs, it's about the hysteria generally of the time. Arthur Miller said, this is happening 5 years after the war, 5 years after 6 million Jews were burnt. You cannot expect us to see 2 more Jews about to be burnt or electrocuted, effectively burnt. You can't see these 2 Jews without seeing anti-Semitism in all of this. But quite where you bring the needle down, I'm not quite sure, but we have to say it was there.
I'm going to move on to something else that you explore greatly in the book. And very interestingly, I think you don't come up with an answer. And that is Ethel's investment in being the perfect mother. And yet she knew at the very end, when the high-ranking officer came to speak to her just before her execution and gave her a last chance to divulge names, she didn't. And she knew that her children would end up in the hellish children's Hebrew home in the Bronx, that they would not have a mother. The government, you point out, was brutal to the children later on, trying to institutionalize them, trying to prevent them from having a healthy psychological environment, a loving environment. What kept Ethel, who knew her husband was bound to die in a few hours, from saving herself and possibly being able to influence a healthy development for her children?
Well, that is the big question, of course, but you tell it as if she had a choice. And the way I see it, I don't believe she did actually have a real choice. So what could she have done at the last minute? First of all, she did not believe she was guilty. She did not believe that she had been involved in spying, and she didn't know many people to name names. And I think naming names was the last thing either of them was going to do. They didn't see why other people should suffer the hell that they had had. And for 3 years, they had refused to name names. And some people have told me or have explained that they know their lives were saved by Ethel and Julius not naming names. Other people, younger people, escaped. So I think they felt there was a moral way to behave. And given that she could not pass on any material goods to her sons, no money, no nothing, what could she give them other than a legacy? And I believe as her options narrowed, and I do think she was clear-eyed that she was going to die, she felt the only thing she can give them to live by is this idea that she was loyal to her husband, and that loyalty matters more than betrayal. Betrayal is what the green glasses did. And the sons have often said on record, not just to me, that they would rather be the children of Ethel and Julius than the children of David and Ruth Greenglass, even though those children had parents. And, I've been to Sing Sing, I've seen the cell, I've tried to think what it was like for her during those long months with nobody to talk to, nobody to discuss what were her options. I mean, suppose she'd confessed to something. There was no guarantee she'd be released. She might have been given 5 years or 10 years. And what really agonized her, I believe, is the idea that her sons would disown her at this point, that her sons would say, "You killed our father." And being a mother under those circumstances was not worth it for Ethel. And I think she felt it was better to leave her sons with this noble ideal, which you might think is crazy because she didn't know about the Mirapols, but I think she justified it, that giving her sons this notion that loyalty is one of the greatest gifts I can leave you, or the only gift I can leave you, is about all she was left with.
Thank you for that explanation that the boys might have found her guilty of crime against their dad. That really helped me. Thank you. Stephanie, help me now.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I appreciated the book very much. I thought it was a fascinating read, and I appreciated the complexity that you gave Ethel's character, because I think that, guilt or innocence seems to be, were they guilty, were they innocent? That seems to be the conversation. You made it much more complex than that, and her role. I was struck by the portrayal of her in the media as this cold and hard and masculine, perhaps aggressive, so the mastermind. There was a really harsh portrayal of her that I don't know exactly what the question is, because you did say about the sort of the subtle misogyny in the portrayal, and sometimes it's not subtle at all. It seemed, very aggressive portrayal of her. I'm wondering how much that contributed to her demise and her being condemned in the public eye, and then, of course, in the jury's eyes.
Well, I'm sure in the public eye, because 70% of Americans were in favor of her death. And I think the one wavering juror was won over by the argument, look, she's a communist, she's not on your side. What happens if we let her go and then she does some terrible thing? Won't you feel responsible? You've got to take that responsibility. So even though the government always knew that the evidence against her was weak or shaky, even though Hoover in the end did not feel that she should be killed, even though Meredith and Gardner, who did the transcriptions of the code, wrote to Eisenhower and they knew that she was not a guilty spy and shouldn't be killed, even though there was all of that, they nonetheless felt that the authorities, the government, Eisenhower, had to go ahead with the killing, and they had to justify it. And the way they did that is by pitching Ethel as this transgressive, older master to Julius the slave. And that's why they couldn't show any images of her as sweet or motherly or kind or cuddly or any of those things, or conflicted. She had to be this stereotypical communist, which, there probably were elements. I've described to you her single-mindedness. I'm sure some people who knew her would describe her as a single-minded communist who believed this was the best future. But I just think she was a much more complex personality who at the end put mothering above everything. But the image conveyed to the American public could not allow for any doubt like that.
Right. Well, you very successfully portrayed that complexity. I want to call on Brenda, who has her hand up. Brenda, you can unmute. You're still muted, Brenda.
I just finished reading the book, and it was, I was 13 when she was executed, and I went to services that night, and the rabbi said a prayer for them. And I think, first of all, Jews are our own worst enemy because we want to look good for the world. I know my mother, who was born in the Ukraine and came here as a little girl, if any Jew did anything that was made public, it was a shunda. It was terrible. You shouldn't do that. And so the prosecutor, who I believe died, was either in your book, you said it, or I somehow of AIDS or whatever, and whatever he was, all of these people, because they weren't perfect, so they had to put it on somebody else. But also, the prosecutor knew that she didn't type those things. She did like handwriting or whatever, and that he lied. Her brother lied. And for shame on the family and the way her mother was treating her. And yes, if she could only leave her children one thing, what more beautiful thing can you leave than the moral way to lead your life? I met her sons in Newton, Massachusetts. When I was a young mother, they came to a temple and I went there to hear them speak. And at that point, they thought both their parents were innocent, but later then I heard that they realized their father wasn't. But it certainly wasn't when they wanted to clear their mother's name. It wasn't for financial gain, because they didn't get any real money out of this, did they?
No.
And so, if your children are the most important thing to you, well, wage, to me, I mean, communism, of course, is not the way I want to be financially secure, so I don't want to share my money and all of that. But I just don't understand. She was a very complex person, but today she wouldn't have died.
No.
And I think if they had more Jewish jurors, she would have died. She would have gone too, because like my parents, I think, were typical. Oh my God, what did she do? Well, we can't have this. It looks bad for the Jews. And that's where I want to just leave it. And thank you for writing such a beautiful book.
Excuse me, I just have to interrupt. Somebody is sharing the screen. There we go. Okay, nobody can share the screen. Thank you,
Anna, for writing such a beautiful book.
Thank you. If there are other questions in the audience, please raise your hand. I'll read a couple of the questions that have been written in the chat. Stan asks about Ethel's sons as adults. Did they bear resentment to those in government who condemned their parents?
It seems not. I think the Mirapols and their natural intelligence. I mean, I feel very presumptuous talking about these adult men who can speak for themselves. They both became college professors, retired, and it seems to me that they have just the right mixture of respect for their parents and for their birth parents, and love for their adoptive parents. And it's just, to me, that is the most extraordinary part of the story.
Yeah, thank you. Al, you can unmute. Al Beagle.
Who raised their sons?
Anne and Abel Mirapol, who had to fight for them. They were a couple in their 40s who'd had 3 stillbirths, and they were musical, and they were teachers, and they were just obviously lovely, wonderful people.
Right.
I see that somebody asked about what happened to David and Ruth, so I'll take that question. David came out after serving less than 10 years. His wife never went to prison. She was never indicted. She stayed at home to look after the kids. And David, when he came out, did a 60 Minutes program in which he admitted that he'd made up the story about typing. He said, honestly, he couldn't remember who'd done the typing. Maybe nobody had, or maybe his wife had, but he had no remorse for what he did. He said his sister was stupid. She easily could have got out of it. I don't believe she did have that choice. And he lived till he was about 92. He died in 2015. That's why his grand jury statements have only recently come online after his death. He changed his name, and I do know what the name is, but I took a decision with the Mirapols, a joint decision not to reveal the name. It's probably not very difficult for anyone to find out if you have a minimal of sleuthing skills. But I felt that his children, he had a son and daughter, did not deserve to be tarred by their parents' actions. So I haven't revealed their name. He lived in obscurity and he didn't have much money.
All right, thank you. I think we're going to start to wrap it up. I have to correct a mistake that I made at the beginning. I really was remiss in not thanking Raven DeSalvo Hess of the Mandel JCCs of the Palm Beaches. They are also our partners in this, and I neglected to introduce myself. I'm Stephanie Owitz, Director of Horticulture and Learning at the Levis JCC in Boca Raton. I was a little flustered at the beginning because of the technological demons that were bothering us, and I've calmed myself down and remembered my mistakes. So I wanted to correct that, and of course, thank once again all of my partners. And I need to mention our next program, which is coming up. We have a wonderful presentation by Lise Perlman, who wrote about the Lindbergh kidnapping, suspect number 1, the man who got away. That is February 1st at 7:30 p.m. So please make a note of that. You'll hear about that from your JCCs in their emails and marketing to you. We have many more throughout the season, so I won't list them all now, but keep an eye on your emails from your JCCs. Thank you very much, Anne, for this wonderful presentation and excellent book. And Eric, thank you for helping us in getting through the conversation. I appreciate it so much. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.